If you're a fan of any kind of heavy music, power chord enjoyer, degeneracy aficionado, any fan of the heavier side of music, you probably have already built a shrine dedicated to this man, got down on your knees and intensely worshipped Black Sabbath. These brummy fellas entered a scene chock full of virtuosos and overproduced bright guitar music and decided to put out the complete opposite, dark, dreary, relatively simple music that was also as loud as humanly possible. As a result of this change in pace musically, they spearheaded the movement that has gone on to define the decades since, not to mention being a cause of countless incidents of bullying. Although Sabbath have already been documented to death, with countless of videos talking about sheep factory accidents and nocturnal flying creatures, I haven't seen many videos talk about the musicians' personal lives and childhood and how it led them to completely flip music on its head, originally to the dismay of pretentious, snarky critics and eventually to the outright joy and praise of individuals who are similarly pretentious and snarky, this time just smell way worse. So how did Birmingham, fairy liquid bottle caps, and an unhealthy obsession with the Beatles take music from this to eventually this, and unfortunately this? In order to understand the prevalence of Sabbath and what led them to create the music that would go on to be pretentiously debated on Rate Your Music, we need to understand the state of the world at the time, specifically the UK, and even more specifically Birmingham. The Vietnam War was in full effect, with the United Kingdom narrowly avoiding being directly involved in the conflict. Despite the fact that UK citizens were never drafted, the youth still remained fearful. They felt as if any second their world could fall apart as they are helplessly thrusted into war. This, on top of the looming disaster that was the Cold War, left the youth demoralised, hopeless, as if they had no future. All four members of Black Sabbath were working class individuals, with their daily lives involving factory work and traversing around the post-World War II Birmingham landscape. Surprisingly, Birmingham was in a much worse state back then than how it is now, despite what this man may lead you to believe.
Birmingham is a no.
All members of Sabbath were born into a location that was made up of mainly post-war rubble, so much so that the carnage left behind was used as makeshift play parks for the children. On top of the bleak landscape left by war, the UK was still in debt to the United States, resulting in rationing still being utilised within the country. This bleak outlook led each of the eventual members of Sabbath to music for escapism. Probably the most tragic would be Ozzy Osbourne, as he would turn to the music of the Beatles for his escapism. Truly horrifying. This cheeky bugger had laid the groundwork to heavy music in the years prior, with that one Charles Manson song, and had reached the ears of millions around the world. Osbourne wasn't only impressed by the music, he was equally enamoured with the backstory. He saw the Beatles as four working class British youths that were able to escape the bleak outlook presented and become superstars. Osbourne would daydream about becoming a member, even having hopes that one day maybe his sister would marry one of the four members of the Beatles. Geezer Butler, who was originally a rhythm guitarist before picking up bass, would also be inspired by the backstory of the Beatles and took comfort in the idea that anyone, even individuals in his position, were able to achieve their dreams. Alongside this, he also dabbled in occultism, because apparently that helps or something. Butler would be completely put off of occultism altogether when one night he awoke to a dark figure at the end of his bed, which has been speculated by some to be Ozzy in a dressing gown. Both seem equally terrifying, to be honest. Whatever the figure was, it completely turned Butler away from the occult and planted a deep-seated fear within him, leading him to wear a cross at all times, which explains a lot of the stage outfits for Black Sabbath. Geezer Butler was actually the main lyricist for Sabbath, and although the media saw Sabbath as devil music, many of the references to the devil were out of pure fear as opposed to support. Black Sabbath drummer Bill Ward grew up in a music-loving family who would host weekly jazz-related parties to combat the dreary reality of the post-war lifestyle. A family friend and jazz drummer would bring his full kit to the house, leaving it overnight and into the morning. This began Ward's fascination with playing the drums, and he decided he wanted to play the drums full-time at the age of 8. And that just leaves Tony Iommi, who perhaps has the most tragic although inspiring backstory of the four original members. On his final shift at a sheep factory, before going on tour with a previous band, Iommi would lose the tips of his middle and ring finger during an accident, resulting in him being told he will never play guitar again. Iommi was riddled with depression, with his life ambition being ripped away from him. This was until his boss introduced him to the three-fingered jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt. Inspired by the playing of Reinhardt, Iommi would create makeshift fingertips out of fairy liquid bottle caps, allowing him to push down on the strings with much less pain. Although this allowed him to play, there were still limitations, leading Iommi to begin experimenting with different playing styles, eventually landing on the style that would define Black Sabbath's early music. Originally named Earth, Black Sabbath would at first be composed of Iommi and Ward before Butler was added to the mix. The band sought out to create heavy blues music but were without a singer. They found an advert in a music shop reading "Ozzy Zig needs a gig" and invited the mysterious Ozzy for an audition. Iommi recounted that they were shocked at the sight of Osbourne, recognising him as a bullied weirdo a few years below them in school. Draped in tattered old clothes, this slight disgust was replaced with shock when they heard Ozzy's fragile wailing vocals that contrasted with the grinding instrumentation of the band. Due to the band being confused with another Earth, they decided on the name Black Sabbath. At the time, rock music was mostly incredibly bright, with the hippie movement encompassing much of the sonic landscape. What many don't realise about the hippie movement is that most actual poor people couldn't be hippies. They had to work for their money and couldn't afford to be stinky and shoeless for a living. This attitude encompassed Sabbath's early style. They weren't happy-go-lucky hippies, they were working-class youths given little to no hope by the people running the show. They combined this attitude with their love for horror films and science fiction. This led them to the idea of creating rock music that matched the scariness of horror films. The landscape was full of strawberry fields and purple haze. Let's give audiences a taste of rubble, smog and Birmingham. They combined this thematic idea with Iommi's crunchy power chord heavy style of simple riff, Ward's distinctive tasteful jazz style of drumming, Butler's signature bass, and of course, Black Sabbath was born, and before you could blink, self-titled had been released, with the band achieving success leading to various tours being announced. Despite the success, critics didn't really enjoy it. Let me rephrase that, they didn't understand it. In comparison to the contemporary guitarists like Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton, Iommi focused more on riffs than filling the song with as many notes as humanly possible in hopes to impress some backstage groupies. Critics saw the music to be repetitive and skillless, mentioning that the skill was replaced with pure volume. The band were actually given the genre label Downer Rock, some cop-out akin to the acid rock label. This led to US tours advertising Sabbath as the louder, less skilled version of Zeppelin. During these early tours of American war bases in Germany, members of Sabbath would become even more familiar with the Vietnam War, speaking directly to the soldiers who were affected. This was reflected onto their second album Paranoid, specifically in the songs War Pigs and Hand of Doom, that in my eyes commentate on the war in a way that's hard-hitting, without any of the members coming across as preachy musicians, because no, I don't want to imagine all the people you hedonistic, self-indulgent. Hand of Doom would specifically describe the use of in relation to veterans of war, and unfortunately the band weren't immune to the same demons, with drug issues beginning to plague the band's relationship. They went on to release a few more timeless albums with the same lineup before things began to fall apart. Music was progressing at a rapid pace, with more virtuosic bands with a similar volume popping up all over the place. Van Halen would actually support Sabbath on tour, with many audience members attending just for the support act, who would oftentimes upstage Sabbath. Audiences were becoming less interested. Ozzy was beginning to lose his confidence and decided to make up for it through rampant abuse of drugs and alcohol. He would continuously make excuses as to why he couldn't sing, which really affected the creative flow of the band, who were already struggling to put out new interesting music. Disenfranchised by the Van Halen tour, alongside the disappointing release of Never Say Die, the members of Sabbath saw it fit to fire Ozzy from the band in order to hopefully spark some creativity. Ozzy would go on to have a successful solo career, as well as becoming one of the funniest, although kind of tragic motherfuckers on the face of the earth. The remaining members of Sabbath would replace Ozzy with Dio, and go on to release projects that never reached the same height as the early Black Sabbath works. Despite the original lineup ending in tragic fashion, the name Black Sabbath has never really been forgotten, with the logo being stamped on cheap t-shirts and relayed by pretty much every metal musician when asked about their influences. The song Paranoid would go on to inspire many of punk's most influential bands, and slower songs like Hand of Doom would essentially create an entire subgenre named doom metal, which would go on to inspire sludge metal, which probably also went on to inspire countless subgenres that are not only obscure and asinine, but also get recommended to me for a video on a daily basis. The story of early Sabbath remains influential to me, a band that literally had everything going against them, a guitarist without fingers, a singer that many thought couldn't sing, a location that rarely spawned prosperity, let alone famous rock stars. Despite that, they were still able to do it, leaving their mark on culture forever. And at the end of the day, if we are to take anything away from this, it's that.
No, yeah. I never, but I have moments,